And what I have found after years of observing the relationship between thought, emotion, and biology is that the human brain is far more adaptable than we were once led to believe. We are not fixed systems locked into rigid patterns. We are dynamic fields of possibility, constantly reshaping ourselves through attention, emotion, and experience. When I first began studying this, I was struck by how quickly the brain responds to subtle shifts in perception, as if it is listening not only to what we think, but how we think it. This suggests something profound. The brain does not simply record reality, it interprets it, filters it, and in many ways participates in its creation. Every thought carries a biochemical signature. Every emotion sends a cascade of signals through the body, influencing energy, immune response, and even the way we age. I often remind myself that what we repeatedly feel becomes the language our biology learns to speak. But here is where modern research becomes especially fascinating. Scientists exploring neuroplasticity have discovered that neural pathways are not permanent highways, but adaptable trails. The more we repeat a thought or emotional state, the stronger that pathway becomes. Yet the opposite is also true. New patterns can be formed through focused attention, intentional feeling, and sustained awareness. I have come to see this not as abstract theory, but as lived experience. When we shift our internal dialogue even slightly, we begin to alter the chemical environment of the brain. This is not about positive thinking in a superficial sense. It is about conscious participation in the way our inner world organizes itself. The brain responds to consistency, not intensity alone. And this is where emotion becomes central. Emotion is not just a reaction, it is a signal, a form of intelligence the body uses to prioritize experience. When emotion and thought align, they create coherence within the system. In such states, people often report greater clarity, intuition, and resilience, as if the mind is no longer fragmented but unified. Ancient traditions have long hinted at this unity between mind and body, describing it in symbolic language. Today, science is beginning to map those same relationships in measurable ways. What was once described as inner balance is now observed as regulated nervous system activity and synchronized brainwave patterns. We are beginning to understand that attention itself is a form of energy direction. Wherever we place our focus, we are essentially instructing the brain on what to strengthen. This means that distraction is not just a mental inconvenience, it is a powerful shaping force. Over time, it can fragment perception or deepen awareness, depending on how it is used. One of the most compelling discoveries in recent years is that the body often responds to imagined experiences in ways similar to real ones. This raises important questions about the boundary between internal and external reality. If the brain encodes experience through patterns of activation, then repeated imagination may begin to influence physical expression. I do not approach this idea lightly. It requires careful observation and personal responsibility. The inner world is not separate from the outer consequences we experience. They are interwoven, constantly informing each other in a continuous feedback loop that shapes behavior, health, and perception. And yet, despite all of this knowledge, I find that the greatest shift does not come from information alone. It comes from sustained awareness. The moment we begin to observe ourselves without judgment, something subtle begins to change. The nervous system settles, the mind becomes less reactive, and space opens where new possibilities can emerge. I often reflect on how rarely we are taught to notice these subtle internal shifts in daily life. Most attention is directed outward toward tasks, screens, and constant streams of information. Yet the deeper transformation occurs in the quiet moments when awareness turns inward and begins to recognize its own patterns. In those moments, we are not adding anything new, but uncovering what was always present beneath distraction. When I speak of awareness, I am not referring to effort or strain. It is more like a receptive state, where observation becomes effortless and clarity arises naturally. In this state, the brain appears to reorganize itself as if it prefers coherence over fragmentation when given the opportunity. This is where many people report a sense of calm intelligence emerging, not as something imposed, but as something revealed. Over time, repeated entry into such states begins to influence how we respond to challenge. Instead of immediate reaction, there is a brief space of perception. In that space, choice becomes possible, and within choice, there is freedom to shape experience rather than simply endure it. This is not a distant ideal, it is a capacity available within ordinary human consciousness, waiting to be engaged through practice and attention. What becomes increasingly clear is that the brain is not only a biological organ, but also a responsive interface between experience and meaning. It constantly interprets signals from the body and the environment, weaving them into a coherent narrative we call reality. When that narrative is shaped by unconscious repetition, we tend to relive the same emotional outcomes. But when awareness intervenes even slightly, the pattern begins to loosen and new interpretations become possible. This is where human potential begins to expand, not through force, but through recognition. The recognition that we are participating in the creation of our internal experience in every moment. With this understanding, responsibility is no longer a burden, but an invitation to engage life more consciously and deliberately than before. In this emerging perspective, I find that curiosity becomes more important than certainty, because curiosity keeps the mind open to new information and new patterns of awareness. Each moment becomes an opportunity to observe how thought shapes emotion and how emotion shapes biology in return, creating a continuous dialogue within the self that is always evolving. Through this ongoing observation, we begin to understand ourselves at deeper levels of awareness itself unfolding, and I begin to notice that awareness itself unfolding does not require effort in the way we usually assume effort to be. Instead, it behaves more like a return to something already present beneath the layers of conditioning, memory, and expectation. In laboratory settings, I have seen how even brief periods of sustained attention can alter measurable activity in brain networks associated with self-referential thinking. What this suggests is that the sense of self is not fixed, but dynamically constructed moment by moment through patterns of neural integration and sensory input. When those patterns soften, something remarkable occurs. Perception becomes less filtered and more immediate, as though the mind is no longer projecting as much as it is simply receiving. One of the most consistent findings across emerging neuroscience is that the brain thrives on novelty, not chaos, but gentle deviation from repetitive cycles. When we introduce new experiences, new perspectives, or even new ways of interpreting familiar events, the brain responds by forming additional connections. This is not abstract, it is structural change happening in real time. What I find particularly compelling is that emotional states act as amplifiers of this process. When curiosity is present, the brain becomes more receptive, more flexible, and more capable of integrating new information. Conversely, when stress dominates, perception narrows and the system prioritizes survival-based responses over exploration. This is not a flaw. It is an ancient protective mechanism, yet in modern life it can limit the very adaptability that defines human potential. I often ask myself what happens when we deliberately choose states that support expansion rather than contraction. The answer seems to lie in the interplay between physiology and perception. When breathing slows and becomes more intentional, the nervous system shifts, signaling safety to the brain. In that state, cognitive resources are no longer consumed by threat assessment and become available for insight, creativity, and integration. I have observed this in both controlled environments and everyday life. People who learn to regulate their internal state often report a profound shift in how they interpret challenges. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel navigable, not because circumstances have changed, but because the internal framework has expanded. There is also growing interest in how long-term mental focus can influence gene expression through biochemical signaling pathways. While this field is still developing, early findings suggest that lived experience may play a more active role in biological adaptation than previously understood. This does not imply instant transformation, but rather gradual responsiveness over time, shaped by repetition and consistency. I find myself returning again and again to the idea that attention is not passive, it is a directive force guiding which neural pathways are reinforced and which are allowed to fade away. In this sense, every moment of awareness becomes an opportunity to participate in shaping the architecture of mind and body together, and I notice that when attention is sustained without fragmentation, the brain begins to organize information in a more coherent manner, linking ideas that were previously disconnected. This is often described as insight, but from a physiological perspective, it may simply be the emergence of new network efficiency across distributed regions of the brain. I have also observed that memory is not a static archive, but a reconstructive process. Each time we recall an experience, we are not retrieving it unchanged, we are reassembling it, influenced by our current emotional and cognitive state. This means that identity itself is continually updated through interpretation of past experience. When this is understood, it becomes clear that change is not only possible, but ongoing, built into the structure of consciousness itself. I often encourage reflection on the subtle difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is immediate, automatic, and often rooted in past conditioning. Response, on the other hand, implies awareness, a pause in which perception can be evaluated before action emerges. This small gap may appear insignificant, yet it is within this gap that transformation becomes accessible in practical terms. It allows individuals to interrupt habitual cycles and introduce new possibilities of behavior. I find that cultivating this capacity requires patience and repetition, not force, but gentle persistence over time. The nervous system learns that it does not need to default to urgency in every situation. There is also increasing recognition that environmental cues play a significant role in shaping internal states. The spaces we inhabit, the sounds we hear, and the rhythms we maintain all contribute to the brain's ongoing calibration of safety and engagement. This means that transformation is not solely an internal process, but also influenced by external design and intentional practice. I have come to view this interplay as a continuous dialogue between inner awareness and outer experience, each informing the other in real time and shaping the trajectory of perception itself. At this point, in my observation, I find it increasingly difficult to separate what we call mind from what we call body, because they appear to function as a unified informational system, continuously exchanging signals, adjusting states, and refining experience. This unity suggests that personal change is not isolated to thought alone, but distributed across the entire organism, and we are still only beginning to understand the depth of what that truly means. I sense that future research will continue to reveal layers of interaction between attention, emotion, and biological adaptation that we have only begun to map, and this unfolding understanding encourages me to remain open to possibilities that extend beyond current models of explanation. As each discovery builds upon the last, I find myself returning to the simple observation that awareness changes everything. It changes how we perceive time, how we interpret memory, and how we engage with the present moment. And even though these changes may seem subtle at first, they accumulate into significant shifts in lived experience, which brings me to a final consideration that I continue to explore in depth: the role of sustained attention as a shaping force that can be directed with increasing precision through sustained attention. And I often notice that when attention becomes stable, the internal dialogue begins to reorganize itself in ways that are not immediately obvious. There is a measurable shift in how thoughts relate to one another, forming associations that feel less fragmented and more coherent. I have observed this in moments of deep reflection where the sense of mental clutter begins to dissolve, and what remains is a quieter, more organized field of awareness. This reorganization does not require force, but rather a consistent willingness to observe without interruption. When I speak of observation, I am referring to a quality of attention that is receptive rather than controlling, allowing experience to unfold without immediate interference. In this state, the brain appears to operate with reduced internal conflict as competing neural signals begin to synchronize more efficiently. This efficiency is not only cognitive, but also physiological, influencing heart rate variability, hormonal balance, and overall systemic regulation. And I find it particularly interesting that these changes often occur below the threshold of conscious awareness, meaning they are not always directly perceived while they are happening. This raises an important question about the relationship between perception and reality, and how much of what we consider stable experience is actually constructed in real time. In many of the studies I have reviewed, researchers are beginning to map the interaction between focused attention, emotional regulation, and structural brain adaptation using increasingly precise imaging technologies. What stands out is the consistency with which subjective experience correlates with measurable physiological change, suggesting that inner life and biological function are not separate domains, but deeply integrated aspects of a single system. This integration invites a reconsideration of what we call potential because it suggests that capacity is not fixed, but responsive, shaped continuously by attention experience and repetition. In practical terms, this means that every moment offers a point of entry into change, not as a dramatic event, but as a subtle recalibration of internal state. And what I find most significant is that this recalibration does not require extraordinary conditions, but is available within ordinary lived experience. It is present in conversation, in silence, in movement, and in stillness, waiting to be noticed rather than manufactured. As I continue to observe these patterns, I am increasingly aware that the boundary between thought and biology becomes less distinct than I once assumed. This realization does not simplify the system, but rather reveals its complexity in a more integrated form. And I find myself continually returning to the simple yet profound observation that attention is not merely a passive faculty, but an active shaping presence that influences both perception and embodiments. This understanding continues to deepen as I examine the ways in which sustained focus alters subjective time perception, making moments feel either expanded or compressed. In these fluctuations, I begin to see that time itself may be less rigid than commonly assumed and more dependent on neural state and attentional depth. This opens the possibility that our lived experience of reality is far more malleable than previously recognized, and that the mechanisms of perception are still only partially understood. And as I continue to explore these frontiers of consciousness, I find myself drawn to a single persistent question about what might become possible if awareness itself were trained with the same rigor that we apply to other domains of human inquiry. In order to investigate this question, I have begun to examine how disciplined attention practices influence large-scale brain network coordination. What emerges from early findings is that repeated intentional focus appears to strengthen connectivity not only within localized regions, but across distributed systems. This suggests a level of integration that was previously difficult to measure using older observational frameworks. In practical laboratory settings, I have observed that even short periods of coherent mental engagement can influence measurable oscillatory patterns in neural activity. And there is a growing recognition that these oscillatory changes are not isolated events, but part of larger regulatory processes governing cognition, emotion, and bodily function. I have come to interpret this as evidence that the brain operates less like a fixed structure and more like a dynamic adaptive field. This perspective challenges earlier assumptions that neural architecture is largely predetermined and instead emphasizes continuous modification based on experience and engagement. And what I find particularly compelling is the implication that attention training may represent one of the most accessible methods for influencing these adaptive systems without external intervention. In controlled experiments, sustained attentional focus has been associated with increased synchronization across brain regions linked to executive function, emotional regulation, and sensory integration. This pattern of increased coherence appears to correlate with improved cognitive flexibility and more adaptive behavioral responses. And I continue to explore how these findings might translate into practical applications for enhancing learning, memory, emotional stability, and long-term resilience in everyday life. However, what remains most intriguing is not simply the measurable change, but the deeper implication that human consciousness itself may function as an active participant in shaping neural architecture. And this leads me to a final consideration that continues to unfold in my ongoing observation of the relationship between awareness, attention, and the evolving structure of experience. It appears that when awareness is sustained without fragmentation, even for brief intervals, the underlying architecture of perception begins to reveal itself in new ways that were previously unnoticed, suggesting that what we call stability may in fact be a dynamic equilibrium continuously shaped by incoming experience. This emerging view encourages a shift away from the idea of a passive brain toward a model in which consciousness actively participates in its own organization. And as I reflect further on these interconnected findings, I begin to see that the most important shift may not be in what we know, but in how we relate to what we know, especially when it comes to the subtle architecture of awareness itself, which leads me to a deeper layer of inquiry that I find myself returning to repeatedly as I continue observing the relationship between awareness and the architecture of thought itself. Because when I examine thought closely enough, I begin to notice that it does not arise as a single unified stream, but rather as a layered process composed of impulses, associations, memories, and anticipations, all interacting in real time. And what is most striking is how quickly the brain resolves these fragments into what feels like a seamless narrative of self. This construction happens so efficiently that it is rarely questioned, yet when attention becomes more refined, the scenes begin to show, and the narrative structure reveals itself as an ongoing process rather than a fixed identity. I have often sat with this observation long enough to notice a subtle shift in how experience is interpreted. The sense of being a separate observer, watching a world outside, begins to soften, and instead there is a more continuous field of perception, where boundaries feel less rigid and more permeable. This does not dissolve individuality, but rather reframes it as an emergent pattern within a larger system of awareness that is constantly reorganizing itself through input and interpretation. In neuroscience, this aligns with growing interest in how large-scale networks, such as the default mode system, contribute to self-referential thinking, and how modulation of these networks correlates with altered states of awareness. What I find compelling is not the terminology itself, but the implication that what we call self is dynamically assembled rather than permanently stored in a single location. This means that identity is not a static object, but a process that can be influenced by attention, emotion, and repeated mental activity. And when I reflect on this deeply, I begin to see how powerful even small shifts in internal focus can become over time. Because if identity is constructed through repetition, then repetition becomes a form of architecture shaping the boundaries of who we experience ourselves to be. This is where the role of sustained attention becomes even more significant. When attention is scattered, the architecture of experience tends to remain fragmented, reinforcing habitual patterns of thought. But when attention becomes steady, something different occurs. The system begins to stabilize around the object of focus, and in that stabilization, new forms of order emerge within perception itself. I have observed that this order is not rigid but flexible, almost like a living structure that reorganizes itself in response to clarity. And in those moments, the brain appears to conserve energy by reducing unnecessary predictive activity, allowing perception to become more immediate and less filtered through expectation. This connects to another area of exploration that has been gaining attention in contemporary cognitive science, the idea that the brain is fundamentally predictive in nature, continuously generating models of reality and updating them based on incoming data. From this perspective, experience is not simply received, but actively inferred, meaning that what we perceive is always a combination of external signals and internal expectation. And when expectation becomes too rigid, perception narrows, but when expectation becomes flexible, the field of awareness expands, allowing for new interpretations of the same input. I find this particularly relevant when considering how emotional states influence perception, because emotion acts as a weighting mechanism that determines which predictions feel most probable and therefore most real in the moment. When emotion is intense, it can dominate this predictive system, shaping perception in powerful ways, sometimes independent of external conditions. This is not a flaw, but a reflection of how deeply integrated cognition and emotion truly are within the biological system. And as I continue to study these interactions, I am increasingly aware that the distinction between thinking and feeling is far less clear than it appears in everyday language. Thought often carries emotional tone, and emotion often carries informational content, meaning that both are co-creating the experience of reality at every moment. This co-creation suggests that any meaningful shift in perception must involve both cognitive and emotional layers simultaneously, rather than treating them as separate domains. I have also noticed that when individuals begin to stabilize their attention over time, there is often a corresponding shift in how they relate to uncertainty. Instead of immediate contraction or resistance, there can emerge a capacity to remain present with ambiguity without rushing toward resolution. This capacity seems to be linked with greater cognitive flexibility and reduced reactivity in challenging situations. And in practical terms, it changes how decisions are made not by eliminating difficulty, but by expanding the space in which decisions can be considered. What continues to intrigue me is how quickly these changes can begin to appear once attention training becomes consistent. Even small periods of daily focus appear to accumulate over time, creating measurable shifts in both subjective experience and behavioral response. This accumulation effect suggests that the brain is not only adaptive in the moment, but also historical in its adaptation, meaning that it carries forward the imprint of repeated states. And this brings me to a broader reflection on how environment interacts with internal state. Because attention does not operate in isolation, it is constantly influenced by sensory input, social interaction, and contextual cues. The brain is always negotiating between internal models and external signals, adjusting its predictions accordingly. In this sense, environment becomes part of cognition, not merely a backdrop, but an active participant in shaping neural activity. I have come to view this as a continuous feedback loop where perception influences environment and environment influences perception in an ongoing cycle of adaptation. And within this cycle, small changes can propagate over time, leading to significant shifts in how reality is experienced. This is particularly evident when individuals intentionally alter their surroundings to support focus reflection or emotional regulation. As I continue to explore these dynamics, I find myself increasingly focused on the threshold moments where one pattern of perception begins to dissolve and another begins to form. These transitional states are subtle, often overlooked, yet they seem to hold important clues about how change actually occurs within the system. It is in these moments that the brain is neither fully committed to the past pattern nor fully established in the new one, and something fluid emerges that feels both unstable and full of possibility. And I often wonder whether these transitional spaces represent the true point of access for conscious influence over neural organization, because it is here that the system appears most responsive to new input, most open to reconfiguration, and most sensitive to the direction of attention, which continues to reveal itself as a guiding force in ways that I am still trying to fully understand, especially when considering how deeply it is intertwined with perception memory and the ongoing construction of experience that seems to extend further into the nature of awareness itself, which is beginning to reveal itself not as a fixed structure, but as an ongoing negotiation between attention, memory, and interpretation that never truly pauses, even in states we call rest. I find that when I remain with this observation long enough, the sense of separation between observer and observed begins to soften in a way that cannot be forced, only noticed as if perception itself becomes aware of its own movement. And in this recognition, there is a subtle reorganization of internal narrative, where thought no longer appears as an uninterrupted stream, but as discrete pulses of meaning arising and dissolving within awareness. This perspective allows me to see that what we call continuity is often a reconstruction assembled after the fact, rather than a single unbroken line of experience. And when this is understood, something important shifts in how responsibility is perceived, because if experience is constructed moment by moment, then participation becomes unavoidable. I do not mean this in a philosophical sense alone, but as a practical observation that attention and interpretation are constantly shaping the lived field of experience. And as I continue to examine the subtle mechanics of awareness, I notice that the brain does not simply react to reality, but anticipates it, continuously constructing predictive models that are refined through feedback. This predictive function means that perception is always slightly ahead of experience shaping interpretation before conscious awareness fully registers the moment. And in that delay between prediction and awareness, there exists a space that feels almost like potential itself, where new choices can emerge before habit takes control. This is the space I continue to study most closely because it appears to be the threshold where conscious intervention becomes possible within otherwise automatic processes. I often notice that even a slight increase in awareness within this interval can alter the trajectory of thought, leading to different emotional outcomes and behavioral responses. And this observation leads me to consider how deeply entrenched patterns can be gently reshaped through consistent engagement with present moment awareness, rather than through forceful attempts at change. I find that the nervous system responds more effectively to subtle repetition than to intense effort, suggesting that sustainability matters more than intensity in long-term transformation. And this brings attention to the role of daily lived experience, where small, consistent shifts accumulate over time into significant changes in perception, identity, and behavior. I have observed that individuals often underestimate the power of incremental change because the effects are not immediately visible, yet they compound in ways that become undeniable over time. And as I reflect on this compounding nature of experience, I begin to see how attention acts as the primary mechanism through which these small changes are reinforced or dissolved. When attention is fragmented, reinforcement becomes inconsistent, but when attention is unified, patterns become more stable and easier to transform. I also notice that emotional tone plays a decisive role in whether a pattern is strengthened or weakened over time, because emotion tags experience with biological significance. This means that emotional regulation is not separate from cognitive development, but deeply embedded within it, influencing how effectively new neural pathways are formed. I find that when emotional stability increases, the capacity for learning and adaptation also expands, creating a more receptive internal environment for change. And this receptive state is not passive, but actively engaged, allowing information to be integrated with less resistance and greater coherence across mental and physiological systems. I continue to explore how these states of coherence influence decision-making, especially in complex situations where multiple variables compete for attention and resolution is not immediately obvious. In such moments, I have observed that individuals who maintain steady awareness tend to access more creative and adaptive solutions compared to those who react impulsively under pressure. This suggests that stability of attention may be more important than speed of reaction when it comes to higher order problem solving and emotional resilience. And as I continue to reflect on this, I find myself drawn to the subtle architecture of intention itself and how it shapes the direction of awareness without forcing outcomes. Intention in this context is not rigid willpower, but a directional clarity that gently organizes attention toward chosen patterns of experience. And when intention is combined with sustained awareness, there appears to be a synergistic effect that amplifies coherence within both thought and emotion. I find this synergy particularly important because it suggests that transformation is not dependent on a single factor, but on the integration of multiple aligned processes. This integrated view of change moves us beyond simplistic models of cause and effect and toward a more complex understanding of systemic interaction within consciousness. And in that complexity, I often find a deeper sense of order emerging, not as something imposed, but as something naturally arising from coherence itself. And this sense of coherence becomes a guiding reference point for how awareness continues to organize experience moment by moment. I continue to examine how sustained coherence may influence long-term adaptation in both psychological resilience and physiological regulation across varied contexts. And what becomes increasingly clear in this exploration is that the boundaries of what we consider possible are far more flexible than conventional assumptions suggest. This flexibility does not imply randomness, but rather a structured adaptability that responds intelligently to sustained patterns of attention and experience. And as I continue to reflect, I notice that even the act of reflection itself begins to change the nature of what is being reflected upon, which suggests that awareness is not separate from its content, but actively participates in shaping it in real time. And this realization continues to deepen as I observe how subtle shifts in attention create cascading effects across thought, emotion, and perception, leading me further into the inquiry of what consciousness itself may ultimately be revealing, layers that extend beyond ordinary cognitive models and into deeper fields of integrated awareness still unfolding within ongoing observation itself evolving.
When we step back from the narrative of the brain as a fixed organ and begin to observe it as a living adaptive system, something important shifts in how we understand ourselves. I want to guide you through this slowly because these ideas are not meant to stay in theory. They are meant to be experienced. At its core, modern neuroscience is revealing something surprisingly simple. The brain changes based on what we repeatedly focus on. This ability is called neuroplasticity. But instead of thinking of it as a technical term, imagine it like a garden. Every thought you repeat is like watering a specific plant. Every emotion you return to is like sunlight reinforcing that growth. Over time, what you tend to grow stronger while what you ignore slowly fades. This means your inner life is not random, it is trained. Now consider attention. Attention is the steering wheel of this inner garden. Wherever you place it, you are essentially telling your brain, this matters. If your attention constantly moves towards stress, fear, or past memory, the brain strengthens those pathways. If it moves toward clarity, learning, observation, or calm awareness, those pathways begin to strengthen instead. A simple real life example is learning to drive. At first, every action requires intense attention. But with repetition, the brain automates it. You no longer think about every step. This is the same mechanism behind habits, emotional reactions, and even self identity. You are not just learning skills, you are training patterns of being. One of the most important discoveries in this field is that the brain does not distinguish sharply between real and vividly imagined experience. When you repeatedly imagine something with emotional intensity, the brain activates many of the same circuits as if it were actually happening. This is why worry can feel physically draining and why visualization techniques can improve performance. The body responds to the meaning your mind creates, not just external events. This leads to a powerful insight. Your internal world is not separate from your physical experience, it is continuously shaping it. But there is a deeper layer here. The brain is not only reactive, it is predictive. It constantly tries to anticipate what will happen next based on past experience. Think of it like a personal forecast system. If your past has been filled with stress in certain situations, the brain begins to predict stress even before it happens. That prediction becomes your emotional reality before anything external changes. This is why two people can experience the same situation but feel completely different internally. They are running different predictive models based on their past conditioning. Now, here is where awareness becomes powerful. When you bring conscious attention to your internal state, you interrupt automatic prediction. It is like stepping outside the weather system rather than being inside it. In that moment, you are no longer fully controlled by habit. You are observing it, and observation creates space. That space is where change becomes possible. Let me make this practical. Imagine you receive a message that triggers frustration. Normally, the brain reacts instantly interpretation, emotion, response. But if you pause even for a few seconds and simply notice there is frustration arising, something subtle happens. You are no longer completely inside the reaction. You are aware of it. That awareness changes the trajectory of the response. You may still feel the emotion, but you are not fully governed by it. This is not about suppressing emotions. It is about seeing them clearly enough that they no longer unconsciously control behavior. Another important concept is coherence. When your thoughts, emotions, and attention are aligned, the brain and body function more efficiently. You might notice this in moments of deep focus, creativity, or calm problem solving. Time feels different, thoughts flow more clearly, decisions feel less fragmented. In contrast, when attention is scattered and emotions are conflicting, the system becomes noisy. You might feel mentally exhausted even without physical effort. This is internal incoherence. A simple way to understand coherence is to think of an orchestra. When each instrument plays its own rhythm without coordination, the result is noise. When they align, even complex music becomes harmonious. Your internal world works in a similar way. So, how do you begin to experience this coherence more often? First, start with attention training. Not in a formal or complicated way, just practice returning your attention to one thing at a time. It could be your breath, the feeling of your hands, or the sound in your environment. Every time you notice distraction and gently return, you are strengthening neural stability. Second, regulate emotional input. This does not mean avoiding emotion, but becoming aware of what you repeatedly consume. Conversations, media, and internal dialogue all shape emotional baseline. If your input is constantly chaotic, your nervous system learns chaos as normal. Third, slow down your response to triggers. When something activates you, treat it as a signal rather than a command. Ask internally, what is actually happening right now, independent of my interpretation? This question alone creates space between stimulus and reaction. Fourth, use reflection as a tool. At the end of the day, instead of replaying events emotionally, observe them like a neutral witness. Ask, what patterns repeated today? Where did my attention go automatically? This builds self awareness without judgment. Fifth, introduce moments of intentional silence, not as escape, but as reset. Even a few minutes of quiet observation allows the nervous system to recalibrate. In that silence, you are not trying to change anything. You are simply allowing the system to settle. Over time, these practices do something subtle but profound. They reduce unconscious reactivity and increase conscious choice. And choice is where human experience becomes flexible rather than fixed. It is important to understand that this is not about becoming perfect or eliminating emotional fluctuation. It is about increasing awareness of how those fluctuations arise and how quickly they pass when not reinforced. Most people think transformation is about adding something new. In reality, much of it is about noticing what is already happening without awareness. When you begin to see your thoughts as events rather than identity, your emotions as signals rather than truths, and your attention as a trainable force rather than a random flow, your relationship with experience begins to change. And this is where the deeper insight emerges. You are not separate from the process of your own mind. You are participating in it continuously. Every moment, the brain is being shaped. Every moment, attention is sculpting perception. Every moment, small choices are building the architecture of future experience. And as we begin to recognize this, a quiet responsibility emerges, not heavy, but empowering. The realization that awareness itself is not passive, it is creative. And in that recognition, we begin to explore something even more subtle.